As a forward, sorry that we haven't had any videos up lately. Our manager, Jazzy, had been doing boxing as a publicity stunt. I mean, sure, I was the WBBA champion for a while, but dude, I'm 15. Couldn't you have picked something actually related to YouTube? Whatever, onto the video. Okay, I really like the Mr. Men show, but I've gotta admit that it's pretty formulaic. As soon as you know which characters are in the segment, you generally know what's gonna go down, especially if you see characters like Mr. Bump or Mr. Nervous. But for a show that can be as wacky and random as this one, why does this occur? How can the Mr. Men show be so unpredictable, yet predictable at the same time? It all comes down to the show's basic structure, or at least what I believe that structure to be. Speaking of show structure, let me jump right into my theory on how the show and its characters were written. The Mr. Men show, or more specifically its characters, follow what I call the aggressor/victim format. What's that, you may be asking? Well, as the format goes, each segment of the Mr. Men show will have two core characters, one of which will be the aggressor and the other of which will be the victim. If that doesn't make sense, allow me to present an example. Let's say we have two characters, Mr. Fussy and Mr. Messy. In this hypothetical segment, Mr. Fussy is trying to clean his floor, but Mr. Messy keeps accidentally messing it up again, frustrating Mr. Fussy. In this segment, Mr. Messy would be the aggressor and Mr. Fussy would be the victim. A good example of the aggressor/victim format from the actual show comes from the episode Rainy Day from season 1. In the first segment of this episode, Mr. Stubborn drags Mr. Bump out into the rain for a picnic, despite the latter not wanting to. Of course, everything goes pretty badly. In this segment, Mr. Stubborn is the aggressor and Mr. Bump is the victim. That seems pretty simple, right? Well, it is really. Two kinds of characters. But what about segments with more than two characters? This is where things get a bit complicated, so here I'll introduce a secret third role a character can have, being completely neutral. Neutral characters don't conform to the format and are usually just there to support the aggressor and victim's character story. Let's reuse that example segment with Mr. Fussy and Mr. Messy, but with a twist. I'll throw in Miss Chatterbox, who's talking to Mr. Fussy as he cleans his floor. As she's not doing anything to harm Mr. Fussy, nor be contrary to Mr. Messy's actions, she's a neutral character. My prime example of neutral characters being used in the actual show is in the episode Game Shows from season 2. In the third segment of this episode, Mr. Fussy, Miss Giggles, and Mr. Stubborn are on the game show What Do You Know About Music? Throughout this segment, Mr. Fussy keeps on trying to answer questions, but Mr. Stubborn interrupts him. Of course, Mr. Fussy's our victim and Mr. Stubborn's our aggressor, but Miss Giggles, who's kinda just chillin', would be a neutral character. Mr. Happy and Miss Sunshine, the hosts of the game show, are also neutral characters. Once again, it all seems simple. Too simple. There's no way every episode of the show has the exact same formula, right? Well, yeah, obviously. While most segments follow the aggressor/victim format to a T, some segments switch things up to keep things fresh. Okay, I'm bringing back the Mr. Fussy and Mr. Messy example again. While we already have our aggressor and victim, let's do the same thing we did last time and throw in an extra character. But rather than being a neutral character like Miss Chatterbox, let's add Miss Whoops. Now, instead of just Mr. Messy messing up Mr. Fussy's floor, Miss Whoops is knocking things over, making even more of a mess. This version of the segment has two aggressors, those being Mr. Messy and Miss Whoops. An example of the 2-1 format from the actual show comes from Picnics from season 2. In segment 2 of this episode, Mr. Quiet is trying to have a picnic on his own, but Mr. Messy and Mr. Noisy disturb him by, well, making a mess and making a lot of noise. Mr. Messy and Mr. Noisy are aggressors, while Mr. Quiet is the obvious victim. This idea also works in reverse, with two victims and one aggressor. Okay, Mr. Fussy and Mr. Messy, get back in here. Let's replace Miss Whoops from the last example with Mr. Bump, who's helping Mr. Fussy clean his floor. Now, not only is Mr. Messy making a problem for two people rather than one, it's likely that Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, will slip on something Mr. Messy spilled, causing him to hurt himself. Now we have two victims, those being Mr. Fussy and Mr. Bump, and one aggressor, Mr. Messy. As an example from the show, let's look at Bath and Bubbles from season 2. In segment 2 of this episode, Mr. Fussy, Mr. Messy, Mr. Nervous, and Miss Scary go to a mud bath, but Miss Scary tries to scare everyone away. Miss Scary is the aggressor character, Mr. Messy and Mr. Nervous are the victim characters, and, in a rare turn of events, Mr. Fussy is left as a neutral character. He kinda just vibes the entire time. Of course, just adding and subtracting aggressors and victims isn't the only way the format can be switched up. Some rare segments actually omit one of the roles, taking out either the aggressor or the victim. An example of an aggressor-less segment would be the vast majority of Mr. Nervous segments. They don't have a real aggressor, as it's all in his imagination. An example of a victimless segment comes from Cars, season 1. In segment 3 of this episode, Mr. Stubborn is trying to sell Mr. Fussy a faulty car, but towards the end, Mr. Fussy's own stubbornness makes him decide to get the shitty car anyways. Both characters are somewhat of aggressors in this really wonky segment. Speaking of Mr. Stubborn, rarely he is a subversion all on his own, occasionally acting as both an aggressor and a victim to himself. The best example I can think of for this weird subversion is in Fair from Season 1. In Segment 1, he's playing whack-a-mole to try to win a prize from Miss Sunshine, but he keeps messing up due to his own stubbornness. I guess later on Mr. Bump could be considered a victim character, but considering he's barely even in this segment, I'm still considering Mr. Stubborn as the keeper of both roles. You may have noticed a few recurring characters on my many examples throughout this video. Mr. Stubborn's often an aggressor character, while Mr. Fussy's often a victim character. Well, they're not the only ones who generally fall into specific roles. Here, I've got a chart of every character and which role they play the most often. Of course, there's a few segments which switch around some roles, but this is generally how the roles will be placed. You may notice that there's way more aggressor characters than victim characters. While I don't know whether this was intentional or not, this may actually be the explanation for the immense oversaturation of Mr. Fussy and Mr. Grumpy that we see in the show. Seriously, these two have over 80 appearances each. It's crazy. The rest of the victim characters are also used pretty often, which makes sense that they had to be reused more often for this format to function. For those of you with keen eyes, you may have noticed that a few characters were missing from my neat little chart. Well, here they are. These three, due to their sad lack of appearances, can't really be classified because, well, we never got to see them in action. For those with even keener eyes, you may notice that there's yet another character missing. Who is this final forbidden character? Who is this uncategorizable being, banished from my special chart that makes everything neat and pretty? Mr. Rude. It's Mr. Rude. Mr. Rude is incredibly unique among the cast of the Mr. Men Show, with his defining trait being, well, he doesn't fall into the aggressor/victim binary. He's split half and half between the two roles, so I can't consider him to be a part of either side. Which is really cool, actually. Mr. Rude's existence gives me a chance to talk about a topic that I haven't mentioned prior, the difference in personality depending on which role a character is playing. Well, sure, most of the time a character will stay in their own niche when it comes to their aggressor or victim role. Rarely they'll play the opposite, resulting in them being written slightly differently to portray the new Cole role. Bringing the topic back to Mr. Rude, I feel that he demonstrates this divergence of personality the best. Aggressor Mr. Rude is often the character people think of when remembering Mr. Rude. He's the general asshole who goes out of his way to make sure nobody else has a nice day. Standard Rude stuff. This variation of Mr. Rude is shown off in Surprises from Season 2. In the first segment of this episode, the main plot is that Mr. Rude straight up breaks into Mr. Quiet's house after his holiday was cancelled, choosing to instead take his holiday there. He then proceeds to be a dick and eats all his food. Yeah, aggressor Mr. Rude is not the character at his best. On the flip side, victim Mr. Rude is a more subversive take on the character. He's still an asshole, but he's usually just trying to get by without getting bothered by anyone. Segments with this version of Mr. Rude will usually excuse others' actions against him by saying that he's, well, Mr. Rude. A good example of victim Mr. Rude in action is in Heatwave from Season 1. In the third segment of this episode, Mr. Rude is just chilling in his air-conditioned house when 6 gay men gradually invade his privacy just so that they can use his air conditioner. I'm not joking, that is a canon event that happens in this show. This segment also demonstrates another trait of victim Mr. Rude, that unlike almost every other victim character, he regularly calls out his aggressors on their actions. You heard that right. Mr. Rude isn't only unique because of him playing both sides of the game, he's even a unique player while within one of his roles. I'll be ignoring aggressor Mr. Rude for the time being, as he's pretty standard for an aggressor character. The majority of victim characters take their abuse pretty quietly, which makes sense if you see who's available to play the role. But Mr. Rude, being the iconic face-breaking, show-stopping, insert compliments here Mr. Man himself, actually bothers to, fight back. While he isn't always like this, such as in Home Improvement, the fact that he isn't exactly the same as every other victim character really sets him apart. Plus, if he can do both, that just means he has even more range. You go, you pathetic depressed tomato! Okay, that entire segment got pretty sidetracked, but hey, it gave me an excuse to talk about Mr. Rude. I could have just not mentioned him when it comes to this topic. Well, I hope you guys learned something about the Mr. Ben Show, even if this entire stretch episode is just speculation. I watched this show way too much to not share the stuff I've noticed. While it's not perfect and doesn't fit every single segment, those segments are very few and far between.
Hey, wait. You mentioned at the start of this video that you were the WVBA champ, right?
Yeah?
Why aren't you champ anymore? Did something happen?
Not something. Someone.